For almost 300 years, African Americans served a nation that wouldn't serve them. They never hesitated to answer the call to duty, Civil War, Revolutionary War, even before the Revolutionary War, all the way through the present. But history shows that even after demonstrating their performance in the field of battle, they were often just sent back into second-class citizenship, and the nation would not recognize what they had done or what they could do.
On July 14, 1919, French, British, and American troops paraded down the Champs-Élysées in Paris, celebrating their triumph in the bloody trenches of World War I. But one American regiment was missing from the Allied ranks. It hadn't been sidelined by injury or a poor service record. In fact, the 369th Infantry was one of the most decorated regiments of the war.
They fought without replacements. They fought 191 days on the front line. They never lost a foot of ground. They never lost a soldier as a prisoner.
The men, nicknamed the Harlem Hellfighters, were excluded for one simple reason. They were black.
Blacks expected as soldiers that they be accorded a certain kind of respect that went with the uniform, that they would be treated like other men in uniform, like whites in uniform. But that was not the case.
Confronting that racism, the Hellfighters' determination on and off the battlefield would become legend and inspire generations to come.
When you were a young black kid growing up in America, my generation in the 40s and 50s, what could you look at that was heroic? 369th was something that was heroic. It was fighting 369th. It demonstrated in battle that black men could do anything that white men could do. And if that's the case in the field of battle, how could it be otherwise in the field of medicine or engineering, teaching, or anywhere else?
On May 15, 1918, two African-American soldiers volunteered for sentry duty. Their regiment, the 369th, had reached the trenches of World War I just 1 month before, and this was their first assignment in no man's land. Early that morning, the sentries heard a rustling nearby. The next moment, the air filled with bullets and exploding grenades. The two privates faced a heavily armed German platoon with little more than their rifles and a prayer. For many black Americans, the front line in France seemed preferable to the ongoing battle against bigotry at home. Although slavery had been abolished 50 years earlier, in the years leading up to World War I, most African Americans still lived under the tyranny of racism.
The institution of slavery served as this incredible sort of police instrument. And once slavery ends, then the dynamic between whites and blacks changes dramatically. So whites have to find other ways of controlling blacks.
Blacks north and south were subjected to systematic segregation. That is segregation in almost every walk of life. Segregation affected how they traveled, where they could sleep, where they could eat, where they would rest when they died.
These controls were enforced by a group of laws and customs called Jim Crow that shackled African Americans with the worst housing, schools, and jobs. Heightening this culture of oppression, white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities.
In the early part of the 20th century, nearly 5,000 black Americans were lynched, burned at the stake, or otherwise murdered in the South. This is the way to keep a new generation of blacks in their place, to send a message to them that there would be limits to their ambition, limits to their aspirations. Lynching, in fact, became a kind of ritual, attended by sometimes thousands of white spectators.
Seeking refuge, many African Americans headed north. And a destination of choice was the New York neighborhood of Harlem.
A migration to Harlem began just after the turn of the century. And for black people to experience coming on a subway from anywhere else in the country and surfacing up on Lexington Avenue at 120th Street and looking around and seeing nothing but black faces like you, for the first time you're not self-conscious. That burden, if you lived in Harlem, was lifted.
Harlem at the time is competing with Chicago as the black metropolis. It would become this cultural center of music and eventually of literature and even drama.
It was the first place in American history where black people could live without prejudice, and it was a very exciting place to be.
As the neighborhood grew, Harlem's leaders looked for ways to develop community pride. They promoted African American arts and businesses. They celebrated New York City's first black police officers. And they began campaigning for their own National Guard unit.
Why would a black National Guard regiment be so important to black New Yorkers? There was this great sense of pride that belonging to a National Guard unit brought to its members. So blacks wanted a part of that. They also understood this historic relationship between military participation and recognition as full-fledged citizens.
But for the same reasons blacks wanted to enlist, whites opposed an African American fighting force.
The idea of armed blacks in uniform brought fear and apprehension to the white community. There was something rather appalling about training blacks to kill whites. So blacks had to fight for the right to fight for their country.
It took a decade for Harlem's leaders to win that fight. In 1916, New York's Governor Whitman approved the creation of the 15th New York National Guard. But the victory was not complete. The governor ignored black candidates and appointed a white man, Colonel William Hayward, as commander. Community leaders were sorely disappointed, but Colonel Hayward soon proved himself an advocate for their cause. The colonel recruited Harlem's civic-minded elite, including a Harvard-educated lawyer, an architect, and a celebrated band leader, James Reese Europe.
There has never been such an organization of Negro men that will bring together all classes of men for a common good. New York cannot afford to lose this great chance for such a strong, powerful institution for the development of Negro manhood of Harlem.
Europe created a regimental band that new recruits found irresistible.
If you're a young man in those days, you hear a band go by and the patriotic juices start flowing, and the next thing you know, you've enlisted.
The band became the most important recruitment tool for the 15th. They would march, on the street. They were really spiffy in their uniforms, and they became quite the talk of the community.
As word of this new unit spread, African Americans from all walks of life were drawn to its recruiting office in the Lafayette Theater.
The large majority of them had very little education. Some of them wasn't even public school graduates. So you had a mixture of soldiers here that with a variation of income, education, and skills. And so the only thing that bound them together was race.
The unit even drew volunteers too young to fight. 15-year-old Needham Roberts lied about his age in order to join the regiment. He, like railroad porter Henry Johnson, saw the 15th as an opportunity to prove his dignity as a black man.
My grandfather came along in a time where a black man was not a man. He wasn't considered even to be a boy. And so that was very hard for somebody that had a strong sense of who they were and that they belonged where they were.
Henry Johnson and his fellow recruits believed they had found a place to belong in the 15th New York National Guard. Their commitment would soon be put to the test. In April 1917, the United States joined its allies, France and Britain, in the war against Germany. Every able-bodied man in the nation was called to the battlefields of Europe, and National Guard units around the country were absorbed into the Army. Harlem's 15th began preparing for war, undaunted by the government's refusal to supply the unit with guns.
They started out in New York City here, and they were training with broomsticks and mop handles, and they made up make-believe machine guns and stuff like that. It's like mock battle, and they dug trenches in the backyards to simulate trench warfare.
Colonel Hayward defied military brass to secure rifles for the 15th. Once equipped, the men said goodbye to their families and headed for training camp. Though most were inexperienced, the 15th drilled strenuously and quickly whipped into fighting shape, becoming known for their discipline. They knew that on the Western Front, they'd be fighting for their country and their lives.
Why would they do such a thing for a nation that treated them so poorly, made them slaves, subjected them to Jim Crow? They felt that if they could demonstrate their performance on the field of battle, then how can they be denied the opportunity to demonstrate their performance in other fields?
By affirming your loyalty to this country, by affirming your patriotism in the most dramatic way possible, by becoming a soldier, you would ensure rights and privileges accorded to white citizens for all of your people. America would be safe for the Negro.
When the 15th got word they were shipping out, they vowed to come home heroes or die trying. The men arrived in France on New Year's Day 1918 and believed they were headed for the trenches of the Western Front. Reality soon struck. Most of the 400,000 black men in the United States Army were segregated and assigned only menial labor. The 15th was no exception. Although they'd trained as machine gunners and sharpshooters, the soldiers from Harlem spent the next 3 months laying rails.
They were never expected to fight, to be soldiers. They were grunts. They did the most tedious tasks. In fact, for some, including my grandfather, it was probably worse treatment than they had experienced before the war.
That was disheartening for the 15th. They were infantry troops. They wanted to go to fight. They didn't want to dig ditches. And they were afraid that once condemned to that's where they would spend the war.
Determined not to let that happen, Colonel Hayward launched a public relations campaign for the regiment, featuring its biggest star, James Reese Europe's regimental band. Though the American Army didn't want black men to bear arms, it welcomed African Americans as entertainers, especially musicians as popular as the 15ths.
The band is assigned to entertain troops, and on the basis of that assignment, travels all over Europe and is considered to be, the best band in the American military, bar none.
The band's high profile brought recognition to the entire regiment, and Colonel Hayward seized the moment to press his superiors for a combat assignment. Initially ignored, the White House soon saw his request as an opportunity. The French army had been demanding American soldiers to fill its thinning ranks, and President Woodrow Wilson was running out of ways to say no. Colonel Hayward's petition gave the United States a way to solve that problem. The U.S. sent the French the only troops it was willing to part with, its black troops.
This is the first time in the history of the United States that they take an integral part of their army and give it to a foreign power. It never happened since.
From then on, the 15th New York National Guard would be called the United States 369th Infantry. Henry Johnson, Needham Roberts, and the rest of the unit received French rifles, French orders, and a friendly French welcome.
They were so astonished when they were transferred to the French that the French greeted them so warmly.
The white officers, the French officers, took them in and were buddies to them, and the enlisted men did the same thing, and they didn't seem to show any of that prejudice that they were so used to at home.
So black Americans were absolutely delighted to be under French command because they were treated as equals.
But this equal treatment was a problem for many in America's War Department.
In fact, some of the soldiers from the United States, the American white soldiers, were trying to encourage the French not to treat the 369th so good because they said, you know how we treat them in this country, and we don't want you to spoil them.
Bowing to U.S. pressure, a French attaché issued a memo instructing his countrymen how to behave toward their new comrades.
Although a citizen of the United States, the colored man is considered by the white American as an inferior being. Try to get the populations of the camps not to spoil the Negroes.
But most French soldiers ignored the memo and treated the men of the 369th as brothers in arms. The troops from Harlem soon discovered that misery in the trenches didn't discriminate either. By the spring of 1918, the 369th was stationed near the German border in northeastern France. It was then that Henry Johnson and his friend Needham Roberts went on sentry duty and found themselves in the fight of their lives.
Needham Roberts and Henry Johnson hear something approaching, and it is a German raiding party. The estimate was that there were about 24 in this raiding party.
And somehow the Germans got a hold of Needham Roberts, and they were going to take him away. And Henry Johnson took his rifle and emptied it into the platoon. Then they dropped Needham Roberts.
They fought fearlessly. Needham was throwing grenades, and Granddad was shooting.
A German grenade got Needham in the arm and through the hip. Some of the shots got me. One clipped my head, another my hand, some in my side, and one smashed my left foot.
At that point, Henry Johnson pulled out his bolo knife and jumped into the crowd of Germans and started cutting and slashing. And he was fighting so fierce that the rest of the Germans ran away.
For his courage under fire, the French awarded Johnson France's highest military honor, the Croix de Guerre with Gold Palm. He was the first American, black or white, to be so recognized. While Johnson and Roberts recovered from their wounds, the rest of the 369th fought on, earning their nickname, the Harlem Hellfighters.
The Germans referred to the 369th as the blood-seeking black men. You know, they just thought, oh, these guys are horrible. They just are relentless, because they were giving them hell every which way but loose.
At the end of September 1918, in an effort to drive the Germans out of northern France, the Allies staged a massive attack. The 369th manned a key stretch of the front line near the town of Seychaux.
At one point, the only thing between Paris and the German army was the 369th. And they wanted to get through there in the worst way, but the 369th wouldn't give a budge an inch.
In a battle that helped turn the tide for France, the 369th captured Seychaux. Their success proved invaluable to the Allies' triumph over the Germans in November of that year. Of the 2,000 original Hellfighters, more than 800 had died. To honor their heroism and sacrifice, France awarded the entire regiment the Croix de Guerre. The men of the 369th had achieved their goal. They'd proven themselves on the field of battle. And yet, when the Allies gathered in Paris for their victory march, the 369th wasn't invited.
The American military did not want black soldiers after the war mingling with French citizens, especially French women. So there was an order sent out basically to get all the black troops out of France and back home as soon as possible.
Can you imagine the offense committed against these troops, even though they had died in battle? They were not allowed to march in peace and freedom. Just imagine that. Going over, seeing what it could be under the French, and then coming back to the United States to face racism that began in the White House and went all the way through the ranks.
Though excluded from the parade in Paris, Colonel Hayward promised his men that they would have their day. He faced down reluctant city officials for permission to celebrate their homecoming in New York. And on February 17, 1919, the Harlem Hellfighters marched through Manhattan. James Reese Europe and his regimental band leading the way.
They marched through the streets, past the reviewing stands, and crowds of people.
This was just for them. The 369th, former Old New York 15th, as they call themselves, marching up Fifth Avenue, going home to Harlem. It was a wonderful day for black New Yorkers.
The crowd cheered loudest for Henry Johnson, calling out his nickname, Black Death. They all wanted to look at the man who'd conquered 24 Germans. But not everyone who saw Henry Johnson saw a hero.
It's interesting to read the descriptions of the New York newspapers about the parade. Pervading their coverage is this sense of dread, that these men have been transformed. They have been tested in battle. They're not going to be the same subservient, passive men who went to war.
Black Americans thought this was the beginning of new opportunities, but found only old prejudices.
When they came back to the United States, they came back to segregation, they came back to Jim Crowism, they came back to racism.
The welcome home simply said, nothing has changed. At least that's what we're saying to you. Maybe you've changed, and of course they had changed, but we feel that nothing has changed to upset the racial status quo.
Far from improving race relations, Black soldiers found that their military service had intensified white hatred. Several black soldiers were lynched while still in uniform, and white resentment exploded that summer when race riots killed hundreds of African Americans in cities across the country. Harlem's Hellfighters struggled on this perilous home front. Needham Roberts suffered from war wounds for the rest of his life. Unable to hold down a job, he committed suicide. James Reese Europe was fatally stabbed after conducting a concert. The band leader died just 3 months after leading the homecoming parade. And 10 years after his hero's welcome, Henry Johnson died, alone and penniless. He was 32 years old.
I just think his spirit was broken and everything was taken away from him. He fought all of his life to be considered a man, a human being, a citizen of this country. And then he died without winning that battle. It's disheartening because we have not done right by those that have fought for this country. You know, my grandfather is a World War I hero. My father was a Tuskegee Airman, and look how long it took people to really honor them. My son is 26 and he is a Marine, and he just came back from fighting over in Fallujah for a whole year. Will he have that same problem when he comes out? I don't know.
History has largely forgotten the heroes of the 369th. Those who do remember honor the Harlem Hellfighters for paving the way. Their struggles contributed to the ultimate desegregation of the military and the rise of African Americans through the ranks.
In my 35 years in the Army, I benefited from what they had done in World War I, World War II, everywhere else. I have always said that I became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the head of all of the U.S. Armed Forces, on the backs of those who went before me.
Why is it important to remember the 369? My feeling is that I'm an American. I believe in the American dream, and I believe that it can happen. But if you look at minorities or African Americans in the military, to get into high ranks like I am, it's very difficult. It is changing, but we're still in the same fight.